welcome again to another episode of Costa Rica Crypto, which I'm of course going to be airing on Trybe as Thomas talks to Trybe. There's been a lot going on this week. I know we just kind of talked. There is always a lot going on, but
when is there not?
Exactly. There's definitely some issues. I went through the EOS Alliance chat, and I spent the better part of a few hours just kind of reading through and taking everything in. And I wanted to kind of do like a fly on the wall perspective of some of the conversations that are going on in there, because I think that there's some really good conversations going on in there. And then in the hopes that other people will kind of understand some of the things and the implications of some of the things that you're talking about, and then perhaps want to join in and be involved in some of these conversations.
Bring it. Whatever shall we talk about, sir? Ask any question. I will have some sort of response for you.
Sounds good. I think I want to start. We're gonna talk about some of the collusion things and a few other really interesting topics today, which I'm very curious to get your opinion on. But I think I wanted to just kind of give one of the conversations that I saw occurring inside of that chat was actually, and it was a very kind of casual conversation, but it had to do with the general consensus on exchanges as block producers. And I was kind of curious what your thoughts were on that, and perhaps kind of, what some of the things are that you've been discussing in the Alliance in regards to that topic.
Super. So one thing that will either delight you or infuriate you, depending on your perspective, is I'm not going to take much of a position on what the EOS community ought to do. I think it's up to the community to decide what it's going to do. The Alliance, of which I'm currently the executive director, its job is to help the community have the conversation. It's not to inject ideas or push the community in a direction. It's to help the community figure out what it wants. And so I might articulate trade-offs. On the one hand, this, on the other hand, that, and you got to choose for yourself where you want to be. And that's not because I don't have opinions. It's because it's not my job to have those opinions. It's my job to present understanding and analysis of the situation. So should we just go straight into collusion? The standard criticism of delegated proof of stake is that it is susceptible to vote buying and cartels and collusion. And specifically what that can look like is if enough people get enough tokens, or enough people who have tokens secretly align with each other, they can pool their power, their token power, and control enough block producers that they can rig the outcome of things. And specifically, if they control 15 or more block producers, they can make those 15, sign fraudulent transactions potentially, or censor things maybe, or a variety of things could happen maybe. And if they only have, say, 7, remember with the supermajority for finality on the EOS mainnet is 15 of 21. So if you have 7, that only leaves 14. So you can't get the 15. So if I am part of some cabal and we control 7, then the non subverted block producers can only get to 14, not 15, so they can't move against us, or whatever that might mean. So we see this in other chains, like there's one called LISK, L-I-S-K, that has a form of proof of stake where their block producers and their token holders are very open. They're like, oh yeah, if you vote for us and we'll split our mining rewards with you, and we'll pay more than the other guy. And it's all just vote buying. And so there's lots of people voting, but they're voting for whoever gives them the most money, not for whoever's going to keep the chain safe. Which in LISK, I don't know what else they do besides, buy and sell votes. Is there anything running on LISK? I don't know about it. But if you want to have a blockchain that's the platform for building dApps on top of, where that you're going to be an ecosystem for people to actually get things done, vote buying and vote selling could be potentially quite dangerous, because even the allegation, let alone the reality of collusion, would start to shake people's confidence in the fairness of the chain, the non censorship. Is finality really final? Are people doing double spend attacks? What else is going on that might be hinky? And if you start shaking people's confidence in the blockchain, then it's hard to build a system on top of it. And so the long run vision, as I understand it, of the EOS mainnet is to be an ecosystem on which dApps can be developed, potentially world changing distributed applications, which means, the whole point of having independent, transparent, trustworthy block producers is that they give us an environment in which we can build those dApps. And the design thinking behind the way we built the EOS mainnet back when I was involved in the original design was, well, we're going to depend on the large token holders to have enlightened self-interest and not do stupid things that damage the value of the token. And that would assume a modestly high level of voter engagement among especially the large holders, and a certain amount of transparency requirement from block producers. So around the time of launch, we were kicking around several different versions of what the block producer agreement would say, and how much transparency and financial disclosure would be required, and so forth. We had a draft that said that every block producer would not only share, who their owners are, but also whether they had any revenue sharing agreements. Every voter, of course, and every block producer has to agree that they're not going to buy or sell votes. That's in the Constitution, and it's in the vote producer command. And so the hope was that having a whole series of different countermeasures would give a defense in depth. So you could discourage it, you could incentivize enlightened self-interest, and if things started to get out of control, you can always use the dispute resolution system and use the fact that the bad behavior is not just bad, it's also technically illegal, quote unquote. It's against the Constitution. Therefore, people who do that are harming the rest of us. Therefore, the rest of us could take them to arbitration and say demand that they stop or demand compensation, or who knows what the arbitrator might decide. So the assumption was never that nobody would ever buy or sell any single votes. The assumption was there might be a temptation to do that, but these other attributes would push the other direction at various various frequencies and at various levels of interaction. So what's happened recently? Well, there was an allegation. For weeks, there's been claims that voting patterns and token movement patterns suggest the existence of collusion. Then a spreadsheet was surfaced in Chinese, which I can't read, that purports to show some sort of arrangement to swap votes, which may or may not be illegal, and pay for votes, which, if true, would in fact be against the Constitution. Okay, so then what's supposed to happen? Well, other voters should notice and respond. And on Friday, somebody did. There was actually a big influx of new votes, and a bunch of block producers changed positions. And some of the most technically competent suddenly went from standby back into active service. So I was told that somebody claimed that they knew who did the voting. I haven't verified it, but it sounds like other interested parties are noticing and are responding. So part of the defense in depth may be being activated. And then the next step would be an arbitration claim. So somebody either has maybe or would need to file a claim saying, I personally have been harmed directly or indirectly in some large or small way by what I believe to be, say, vote buying or vote selling on the part of this or that person. I would like an arbitrator to rule on this. And then the other party would have to respond and say, well, no, I didn't, or yes, I did, you're right, here, I'm so sorry, or something. And then the arbitrator would do things like issue subpoenas, which arbitrators can do. It's not the same as getting a subpoena from, say, the IRS or the FBI or your local police. People do sometimes just ignore subpoenas from arbitrators. But what's interesting is, under the international rules of dispute resolution, if you ignore a subpoena from an arbitrator, the arbitrator is allowed to infer things from your refusal. They're allowed to infer that the other side might be right. So it's generally to your advantage to respond to requests for records and for subpoenas and things. So then, this thing would grind forward over the course of weeks or months. For a big or high profile case, we might see a 3 or even a 5 arbitrator panel and not just a single arbitrator. Who knows? And at some point, enough discovery would happen that a verdict might be reachable, or a finding could be found. And of course, both sides get to see each other's evidence and rebut it or refute it or say, yeah, that's not true, or cross-examine each other, whatever. And so, this is the kind of thing that communities go through. And some folks get very impatient. It's political. Well, of course it's political. That's the definition of settling your disputes in a nonviolent fashion. You either persuade people, or you ignore each other, or if you are forced together because you are in some sort of collective arrangement, like, block production and voting, right? When you entered the EOS mainnet, you became part of a collective. And the constitution of that collective lays out what the collective entity is allowed to do in a collective that is non-voluntary fashion. And if you go back to a book like Calculus of Consent from 1962, you'll find that Tulloch and his co-author lay out in detail, here's what a constitution is. We're all able to do independent activity. We're all able to do fully unanimous stuff as groups. But if you want to do something that's collective, where only a majority has to agree and the rest of us are forced to go along, you have to opt into that. You have to opt into that voluntarily. And once you do, then you're binding yourself to, if the majority votes against me, I'll go along with them. So why would you do that? Well, you do that because the cost of not deciding is very high, and the cost of achieving unanimity is high. And so you decide it's in your enlightened self-interest to bind yourself to this collective for specific purposes. And that's how, collectives get created, co-ops, all variety of things where you have, less than unanimous decision-making. And if you have not looked at a summary of or read the original of Calculus of Consent, highly recommend that. Because it sheds some light on where we are right now.
Great.
So we've got tools to resolve the allegation of collusion, to either clear the name of people or to uncover that maybe there was something that was irregular and what should we do about it. I'm a big believer in, first offenses should be treated fairly lightly. Apologize, say you won't do it anymore, increase your level of transparency, maybe pay a small fine or reimburse somebody you hurt. But then let's all shake hands and go back to, making blocks and getting stuff done. I think that would be lovely. And we'll see what happens. It could be that these even get resolved before things go all the way to an arbitral finding, because, whoever complains, if they have their complaint resolved to their satisfaction, they can just say, okay, I'm done, we'll close the case. That could happen. But we need to have a couple of hard conversations internally in the EOS mainnet community about collusion. We probably don't have as much transparency as we would need to prevent it. We have people who are signing the reg producer contract, but not abiding by the terms of the contract, but being paid according to the contract. Now, when you sign a contract and you take money according to the contract, but you don't actually fulfill the terms of the contract, that's on its face incorrect. And, but these contracts are not self-enforcing. You have to use the mechanisms provided. And maybe, hindsight tells us, hey, maybe payment should only be released when, some rotating panel agrees that, yeah, you've met the terms and conditions and you should have your pay released to you. Right now, payment's automatic, and maybe it was too automatic. Maybe there needs to be some sort of a double check layer, but that could be gamed. Who knows? This is called learning, right? All of life is Bayesian, right? We think we know something, so we try it out. We discover we didn't know as much as we thought, so you try something new.
At
So
this point,
yeah,
sorry, go
go
ahead.
ahead. Go
At
ahead,
this
man.
at this point right now, just for anybody who's wondering, right? Because I think a lot of people, and this is why I'm talking to you right now because I don't have all the facts. A lot of people might kind of think that these allegations have been made, therefore, judge, jury, executioner, take off their head.
Uh, Look, you should assume you give a presumption of innocence just like you'd like to receive a presumption of innocence. Just because somebody alleged something doesn't make it true, doesn't make it false. It makes it an allegation. Okay. And then if nobody ever files a dispute, must not be that important if you're not using the tools that were provided by the system, or you do file a dispute, in which case you're entitled to, have your day in front of the arbitrator and state your case, and the other person can state theirs, and maybe we get to the bottom of it. I'm hopeful that we do use all of the tools provided by the system to resolve our interests and our needs. Long term, we need to make sure that the public, in particular people who are looking for a mainnet on which to build, have confidence in the EOS mainnet. Because if they don't have confidence in it, they won't come use it, and ultimately the chain could wither away. I wouldn't like that.
No.
If there's, a really sharp divide on which direction to go, I hope that doesn't happen. But it's possible there could be a fork where half the people go one way and half go the other way on some crucial issue of how to resolve these kinds of things. Again, not ideal. I'm not asking for that. I don't hope for it. Hope it doesn't happen. But it's possible. It's blockchain. Ethereum is forked. Bitcoin is forked a bunch of times. Okay, we're not immune to that. But I think we can stave it off because I think we're much better off with one big main net than two little ones.
Yeah, for sure. I tend to agree with you. You want a little bit more support in the main net, of course, as opposed to having kind of that divide. And I think ultimately the perception is kind of the main thing right now. That's something that you touched on.
Well, yeah, perceptions are important, but perceptions flow ultimately from some aspects of reality, whether accurate or inaccurate.
Yeah.
And I think the most important thing right now is to work on the reality. So, to me, that's encouraging people who feel they have a grievance to file a dispute. And while you're at it, maybe, find other people who feel similarly and then make it a group effort so you have support for each other. And if you feel like you should be mad at somebody, talk to them directly and tell them, what are your terms? What are your concerns? How do you feel you've been injured? What would you like them to do differently? Don't assume that they're going to say no. They might very well say, oh, well, if this will make the problem go away, we'll just, admit no wrongdoing, but change our behavior. Would that be good enough for you? Might be good enough for some folks. If so, okay, maybe that's one way forward. I mean, ultimately, we want to get back to the business of creating blocks and creating a community people can feel some confidence in to build some dApps and change the world.
Yes.
I mean, to me, that's the, you stick to your true north, okay? Don't forget that. And if collusion's a problem in your mind, as it probably is in a lot of minds right now, as it should be, I think, based on what we've heard and what we've seen in voting patterns, okay, demand improvement. Come up with some constructive ideas and move forward. One line of argument I want to crush, by the way, is people who say, well, it's inevitable, you can't stop it. It's like, so's murder.
This is accurate.
So, yeah, name me a crime that whether financial or property related or people related or whatever. It's like, just because the you can't stop it is not some sort of like magic, trump card you can play to say, oh, then let's get rid of the rule. That's just stupid. Now, there are things you shouldn't have rules against because it creates unnecessary black markets. I'm a libertarian. I'm a big believer in legalizing and managing socially most of the human vices,
Yep.
But vote collusion is not one of those. This is the principal agent problem. If you're not familiar with the principal agent problem, there is, decades of literature on the principal agent problem. This is just another instance of it. There is nothing new in governance. Crypto may be new, but governance is not. And so we have age-old ways of dealing with this. One of the reasons you might make something illegal and or against the contract, even though it's hard or even impossible to spot some or all of the time. It is several-fold. If I make a practice illegal, unenforceable under the Constitution, it means that if I have a contract to sell my vote to you, it's an unenforceable contract. If you and I have a vote swap contract and then one of us reneges on it, what's the other one going to do? Take you to arbitration? You can't. It's not enforceable. Oh, so what you're doing there is you're making it very hard for people to trust each other in this realm where you've said that you're not allowed to do X. All of the other, you couldn't write a smart contract to enforce it because smart contracts are visible to the world. You can imagine the uproar if somebody had a vote buying, vote selling smart contract operating, which if it were legal would be done.
It would, yes.
Right? And it'd be totally transparent, highly verifiable, safe vote selling. No, I don't want that. I want your vote buying and vote selling to be highly risky, utterly unreliable. I don't want you to trust your partner in collusion. If you've got a big consortium or a big cartel, doing this illegal thing, I want there to be a lot of holes where the information can leak out. The bigger the conspiracy, the more leaks it has. Okay, great. And then somebody can cut a deal and say, hey, look, I'll rat on the rest of the group if you reduce my fine to zero.
True. When you hear about these kind of problems, because you're always so optimistic, do you kind of consider it seems like
I'm not optimistic at all. I read Thomas Schelling for fun. Okay, I'm a big believer in power politics and people acting in their own self-interest, and greed and selfishness and short-sightedness and stupidity are a big part of the human condition. So are the more enlightened aspects, but I don't expect the enlightened aspects to win.
Do you see these things though as kind of it seems like you almost enjoy this? This is a challenge for EOS. Let's see if the system works. And that's
yes, of course. I believe people are about as grown up as they choose to be.
Yeah.
And when Dan Larimer and I were putting together the governance pieces, we knew they wouldn't be perfect. We knew we were doing our best under time pressure to do something that could be made to work if people wanted it to work. And now it's up to the community to run this thing. And so I am highly optimistic that a committed group of individuals could band together and use the levers and knobs provided and make this work pretty darn well. I think collusion could be made not very profitable and fairly disreputable and generally unattractive. And you could probably, if you needed to, say, amend the Constitution to tighten that up, which in fact you might need to do, we might need to change reg producer and parts of the Constitution to tighten up the controls and make the block producer role require more transparency and not let people collect money just for being voted for. There might need to be some sort of additional screening somehow. Don't know what that would be. But that would certainly shut things down. If I can't just, stand up a standby block producer with no website and no node and no person and nothing. All it has is an address, and I get 0.49% of the vote to it. Now it starts collecting money, and oh look, I've got free money. Well, you shut that off. You take away that incentive. Okay, maybe that's a way to go. One of our challenges is that the net went live without a referendum, as you know, without a way to validate, to ratify the Constitution or amend it, and without a good, strong identity solution, even an optional one. And I think identity for block producers would go a long way. I don't know that we need identity for voters necessarily. In longer term, I would love to see us as a community move eventually to a bicameral system where we've got token voting and identity voting, and maybe they have to both, achieve a majority vote to do certain kinds of things. I think that could be fun. Maybe the dApps should get a vote. There was a very interesting article written some months ago about how the most popular and most used dApps who bring the most traffic and the most usage to the chain should have some political standing. That'd be cool.
That would be
Why
cool.
not?
Yeah. Would Block.One ever use their votes if would Block.One ever use their votes, or would they ever use their votes in a referendum, or are they just kind of?
Well, of course, I don't work for Block.One anymore. We
What do you think?
separated amicably as planned. I was talking in February to Dan about when is my governance role done, and we agreed it was going to be done in June.
Yeah.
So I resigned at the end of June. But we've known for a long time that. I'm sorry, I'm trying to drift off point. Your question again, say it again.
No problem. I'd actually like you to address this even.
Are they going to vote? Yeah. I asked that. I kind of assumed that Block.One would never vote. In fact, I assumed originally that the locked up tokens would be unvotable.
Yeah.
And that came up in a bunch of, Telegram chats, and I kept asking Dan. He didn't get around to answering me until finally, I think it was like April sometime. He said, "Oh yeah, we'll vote if we need to." I said, "They'll be votable?" He said, "Yeah, we'll make them votable." Like, wow, there's a hammer. 100 million votes. Pow. Now there's 900 million other votes, but still, that's a big chunk. And what also became clear to me is that the way the wallets are structured is, if Block.One were to vote, they can't vote with anything less than the full amount. Wow. Because when you cast a vote, it's your vote times all your stake tokens, whatever they are. And there's like slowly shrinking down from 100 million to like 99 million or something. It's like a slow 10-year decay. But it's a big endowment. And so they can't vote small unless they somehow ask the block producers to use their superpowers to chop their wallet up into sub wallets or something. I don't know what standing they would have to ask for that. But yeah, Dan said back in April and May, he said it several times that, oh yeah, I'm totally willing to vote when it's appropriate. And Brendan Bloomer has said that. And when this vote buying allegation came out on Friday, by Saturday or Sunday, Block.One actually published something on Medium saying that they would be willing to vote their tokens as needed to, stabilize the situation and keep the mainnet healthy, as any other token holder should.
Of course.
So yeah, I think we might very well see Block.One vote. I think they're reluctant to vote because they are such a big force. It could come across as very either bullying. Some people might experience it that way, or like somehow they're running things, which they don't want to be in charge. Like they don't want anyone to say, "Oh, this whole chain is really being run by Block.One. It's actually their private project. It's not a public mainnet at all." And of course, if that were ever to stick as an allegation, then suddenly Block.One has liability for anything and everything that happens on a chain that they run.
Of course.
Which I wouldn't want that. You wouldn't want that. Nobody wants that.
Okay.
So yeah, they could vote, and I'm sure that you could imagine scenarios where they would, but they've proven that they're reluctant to, and I'm not in the least bit surprised.
I want to just touch on something that's interesting to learn. I really was I was curious about that, but it's good to know that, and it's good to know that at least Block.One has that in their back pocket. But I just wanted to address something that you touched on, because I think it's really important, and it was a complete and utter, for lack of a better word, BS. An article that I saw recently that said, that you guys had taken off to, the top, basically some top officials inside of B1 had taken off to start this conflicting chain, and there's just a lot of, that was something that we've spoken about several times, and it was something that I spoke up about on Reddit. You know what I mean? That has been in the plans. It's not as if there was a bad breakup or some sort of bad word, and you guys got took off.
I can say very little on advice from counsel.
Okay.
I love being able to say that, even if it's not true. It sounds so like
it's a great idea.
Yeah.
Okay.
There was something in the Wall Street Journal. I love using outside sources because then it's not my opinion. It's just like stuff out there in the world.
For sure.
Let me find this. I've said publicly many times that Dan Larimer and I were talking in February about, when either I would need to, stop working on governance when the chain launches, because like, what more is there to do? We're done. My governance role was to help him create default settings that a community could use to start a mainnet. After the community starts a mainnet, that job's done. So then they would do, and he very clear. He said, we'll find you something else to do here if you want to stick around, and move to Blacksburg, which, by the way, lovely town. And thought about my options, and decided to transition out. So hang on.
Yeah, it was ridiculous. No, when I read it, I guess I wasn't really surprised, but I just it seemed like seemed targeted. And I knew for a fact the difference, because we've discussed it a bunch of times, that the intention was at the end of once the chain was launched, you were going to depart. So,
well, I'll say more generally, anytime you've got a project that has big phases, like a massive, like, oh my God, get this out the door. Oh, now it's out the door, and now we're going to shift gears and build apps on it, or get into a maintenance mode or whatever. That your personnel needs change.
Of course.
Beyond that, I've been instructed to say nothing. So
I won't push it.
Sorry. I'm sure there, in a week, in a day, I don't know, there'll be some like definitive statement made that clarifies everything. I'll just say, I love Block.One. I love my colleagues from Block.One. I love the EOS software. I'm clearly in the middle of the EOS software and can plan to be for the rest of my career.
Yeah.
And so, people in crypto love to play. There's a game. There's a psychologist. I can't remember his name. He wrote this book called "I'm Okay, You're Okay," and he called games people play. And he viewed a lot of people's interactions as game-like. And one of the games he documented in one of his books is called "Let's You and Him Fight." and the game involves talking to one person about how this other person who's not in the room was saying bad things about him, in order to try to get two other people to fight each other while this person, like, I guess, eats popcorn. And the "Let's You and Him Fight" game is played constantly in crypto.
It is.
And so my take is that this whole, acrimonious breakup or whatever, quasi rumor is just another flavor of that someone's trying to play on somebody. And, I think 80% of the quote journalism unquote in our space, it has that subtext or straight up text.
Yeah, I agree. I wasn't really surprised, but I definitely knew the difference when I read it. One of the other things that I thought was kind of interesting that was brought up in the EOS Alliance, getting back to the EOS Alliance, was how is a lot of people will read the Constitution and perhaps think that they understand governance. And some people were kind of indicating that they thought the two were very different, as do I. Reading the Constitution doesn't necessarily make you an expert in governance, does it?
I'm not sure what's required to become an expert in governance.
Fair enough.
I always think experts are like other people who know a lot more than I do. God save me, I wrote that Constitution. I did it under Dan's direction and based on a lot of his writings. So I'm not claiming I invented it. I tried very much not to inject my own stuff in there. But it was my task to go into his multiple articles and other writings, internal and external, and also, talk to the law firms that we had hired and read their stuff. I was so sorry it wasn't made public much earlier, but that you can now get it. It's, I want to give the exact name. I should have this memorized. But there's an article called "The Legal Analysis of the Governed Blockchain" by Norton Rose Fulbright. Norton Rose Fulbright is an international law firm does a lot of intellectual property work, and they were hired to write a detailed analysis of how do you do this new thing called a governed blockchain, rather than everything's anonymous and it's all proof of work and anybody can do anything to anybody and code is law. How do you shift over to this intention of code is law, and you have a constitution and there is, legally binding arbitration baked into the system? Like, how do you do that? and what would be required to make it work. And Norton Rose Fulbright wrote a detailed analysis of that, which heavily influenced the design of the EOS mainnet governance model. So if you want to understand the Constitution, you need to read that. I'll give you a couple of quick hits, though. If you want to govern blockchain, you have to have a constitution. Because you call it a charter, you call it something, but it's going to function as a constitution in the sense that Tulloch uses that word, meaning it is the governing document for a collective whereby the collective takes decisions. And so if you have a blockchain with a constitution, that constitution has to do some things in order to make your blockchain governable. One of which, according to Norton Rose Fulbright, is the Constitution has to be a legally binding contract. It has to have enforcement mechanisms, and it must bind the parties of the blockchain to an arbitration mechanism. If you don't have arbitration, if you don't have a binding contract, your blockchain's not governed. And meaning you're going to, at some point, revert to code is law, not intent of code is law. That's what will happen. Now, you might not like it. You might even disagree with it. But you need to know what these guys said if you want to try to do some sort of intelligent critique of the EOS mainnet's governance system. So again, I recommend the Norton Rose Fulbright write-up is one of the things you would read. It's probably a dozen pages. And that, I was reading early versions of that back in February and March when I was doing the heavy lifting on the Constitution and, folding in all of Dan's writings and so forth. And one of the other design decisions I made, wise or foolish, I don't know, was to not repeat in the Constitution things that were encoded in the code. So nowhere in the Constitution does it say 5% annual inflation. Why? Because the code does that. It's like, why would I need to say it twice? And then if I want to change it, I got to change it in two places. Because if you only change it in one place, then you've got some sort of internal contradiction now. So under the theory that render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's and render unto God that which is God's, I said, look, we'll put in the Constitution things that only the Constitution can do, and things that can be done in code will be in the code. And if it's something you interact with, like a system contract, then we'll have a Ricardian contract in there that has the same force as the Constitution because it's the system contract, like the vote producer command, like the reg producer command. And again, we don't duplicate that text in the Constitution text because then you've got it in two places instead of one, and now you're setting up the possibility of confusion and contradiction. That's bad design, in my opinion. And that has confused a lot of people who didn't read any of the multiple articles written on the subject and haven't listened to my interviews where I talk about this. But if it can be done in code, it's in the code. If it can be done not in code but in Ricardian contract as one of the system contract actions, then it's in the Ricardian contract. If it can only be really handled in the Constitution, then it's in the Constitution. And you look to all three things. And if you want to change inflation, then you pass a referendum that changes inflation. And the place you change it is in the code where inflation happens. Period.
Makes sense.
If you want to change the terms of the reg producer contract, you would need to pass a referendum that said this Ricardian contract's terms change from these old terms to these new terms, and you would vote it in just like you'd vote in a constitutional amendment or a system contract change.
That's perfect. I think that's a pretty good differentiation. Another thing that you guys have been talking, just to create the difference so people are at least aware, because I think a lot of people who are just kind of getting into EOS maybe get those mixed up and don't have a good understanding.
Yeah, I tell you, if you're coming in with, let's say, from a computer science perspective or a cryptocurrency perspective or anything, non-political, you probably haven't wrestled with constitutions, maybe not since grade school or high school or whatever. You might have been forced to look at one. And your mind doesn't go down these paths. And that ain't good because your mind needs to go down these paths. Blockchains are weird, man. You have to unite a lot of different disciplines to understand this stuff and make it work. You have to know sociology. You've got to know game theory. You've got to know a certain amount of cryptography, or at least some of the rules of how cryptographic systems work and what a hash is and how it works and what public keys are. You've got to know a little bit about smart contracts. You have to know a little bit about Ricardian contracts if you're on the EOS mainnet. You've got to know a pretty wide variety of things to engage successfully. And that's a real challenge. And just, if all you want to do is think as a coder, you will miss 2/3 of what's going on.
It's funny you should say that, because it ties into something else that I was going to ask you about, which is often brought up in the EOS Alliance chat room. That boils down to, you're talking about there's a lot of moving parts. So one of those moving parts has to do with the individual block producers and voting. And it seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like voter apathy, of course, is an ongoing issue. I had a conversation with somebody yesterday and did an interview. Actually, no, it was today. I spoke to one of the block producers, and then we kind of talked about how every vote really does matter. But I think that a lot of people might be apathetic in the sense that they're under the impression that their vote doesn't matter. They just don't take the time to do the research to figure out the kind of candidates that they want to elect to have the optimal blockchain that they need to be able to service themselves.
It's rational ignorance. I mean, again, if you start reading political science texts, or you read about how voting systems work, I wish I could recommend Calculus of Consent more highly. It's the seminal work on the topic, but it's very hard to read. It's not like Schelling. It's not like the Strategy of Conflict, which is a great book by Thomas Schelling. I highly recommend that. Calculus of Consent talks about voting and collective decision making, but the writers were academics, and it really shows. It's a little bit dense. So I'll try to boil it down without distorting their meaning. One of the things they point out is that you can have costs that come to you because you didn't coordinate with other people. Then you have the costs of coordinating with other people. Like, try to imagine you're at a group of 20 people and you're all trying to decide what pizzas to order for each other. Like, you're going to set out, you can imagine that if things aren't orderly, or no one shouts loudly and takes control of that, it could be chaos and no pizzas ever get ordered, because people could what's going on? Are we ordering the pizzas yet? Well, I don't like anchovies. Who are you saying that to? No one's taken on any roles or responsibilities, and you can sit there for hours and get no pizza. Okay, so what are you going to do about it? Well, you need to bring some order and some structure to things, and you might end up with a unanimous decision. But how you get to the decision, it's not free. It's going to take time and effort. You might decide to go off and just you and 3 friends who like pepperoni, just leave the group and go get your own pepperoni pizza. Because you sit around waiting for this group of 20 to come up with an answer is going to take much too long for you, right? Decisions have costs. The actual act of deciding is expensive. And so, and if you incentivize voting, we need more voter turnout, we need to incentivize voting. I don't think that's true necessarily. And Tulloch says that there's 2 different perspectives on that, one of which says that you should, if voting brings legitimacy, you might want to incentivize it. But if voting is supposed to bring information, you definitely don't want to incentivize it. Because incentivized voters are voting for the incentive, not voting for the answer. And to educate yourself as a voter is expensive. It is hard. And if you have 1,000 voters that are each supposed to do their own independent research, people don't even research their cryptocurrencies when they're going to put in thousands of dollars on the line.
They really don't.
They're going to spend at least that much time figuring out who to vote for a block producer on a chain they already belong to. Unlikely. So that's why, by the way, I think it's important to have independent research groups like the Watchdogs, which I think do a great job. If you're not tuned into the EOS Watchdog group, I think they do great work.
Yep.
There's the block producer. There's an integrity group, or
that also leads to proxies, right? I don't know.
It definitely leads to proxies. There's a block producer compliance, I think it might be what they're called. Yeah, EOSBP Compliance Data Research is a group, and there's one called EOSBP Compliance. And so there's 3 or 4 groups that have come up that are specifically looking at what makes a block producer a good producer, and they'll give you their lists. They're publishing ratings and rankings. Heck, I did a YouTube video where I laid out an entire framework for how to build a framework for rating block producers. So there's good stuff happening out there. If you want to cast an informed vote, you don't have to do all your own research. You have to find people that you trust, at Consumer Reports, if you will, and then take your own, here's what matters to me. And so you pick and choose through their list and decide what matters to you. And you can assemble a pretty good list of, 25, 30 block producers pretty quickly from reasonably trustworthy sources, I think.
Through proxy voting. For anybody who's not, what is a proxy vote and how does it work?
Yeah, so the way proxies work, and there's also something called vote decay, which I need to mention. Let's say I don't want to do my own research and I find somebody. I just got a note from a guy, the Crypto Kid, who put together his own proxy recently. He was kind of bragging about it. Like, good for you, dude. It really matters to him, and he's really fired up. And so if you read his stuff and you think that he's got the right philosophy and you agree with it, you can go in and assign him or the account he set up to be a proxy, set that as your proxy, and then however many staked tokens you have, when his proxy votes, your votes go with him. So you're saying he gets to vote for me. Now, all votes decay slowly over the course of time. That's another feature of the system, so that votes cast 2, 3, 4 years ago don't just lock up the system and prevent new people with new opinions from changing anything. That's one of the problems with Steam, apparently, is old votes have just locked that thing up tight. So vote decay means that you periodically either need to recast your vote if you're a voter, or reauthorize your proxy if you're using a proxy. And I think proxying is a great way to get the benefit of somebody else's research without having to do all that work yourself. But I personally think that incentivizing voting creates the wrong incentives, and you might get a larger number of votes, but you don't get smarter votes. You get the opposite. You got to decide for yourself if that's good for the system that you're in. I obviously have my opinion.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about Rex. Will that be good for voting?
I haven't followed Rex at all. I couldn't understand it when I first read the first descriptions of it, and my plate is so full. And Rex is like a layer up from whatever the main stuff is. It's a new thing. It's a future. It's an add-on. It's like, it's not affecting me today. I'm not going to track it.
I can't keep up.
When it's delivered, someone can explain to me how it works. But telling me how it's gonna work, I don't. Your brain would explode if you tried to track all the things that are being promised in the cryptosphere. Of this is how it's gonna work. I was reading the other day about some guy talking about Bitcoin in space, and he was going to have like Bitcoin nodes orbiting the planet so that no one would be out of reach of the Bitcoin blockchain. And I'm reading in the description, he's reading it in the present tense, that these satellites orbit the Earth. I'm like, oh my God, that's so cool. And I keep like, when did they launch? And it turns out, no, they haven't launched. They haven't been built. But he's writing it in this, it's like our whole industry has got a challenge with verb tenses in English.
That's accurate.
Everything's written in the present tense as if it's happening now. Stop it.
The love of God. Too good. Yeah, no, that's interesting, man. And I always kind of talk about, there are some really interesting conversations that happen inside of the EOS Alliance. And I will, as a fair word of caution, I would say that I follow governance and I'm up on governance, but a lot of the time I'm not in there. I'm not in there and involved in the debate, but I do really think that it's a good idea for your average token holder to go and to check out what you guys are talking about in there, because it really...
I would say periodically you should check in and just see what the conversation is that day and kind of catch up on what the pending issues are, or read one of the summaries. There's people who put out daily and weekly summaries. You might subscribe to one of those. Yeah. Just to stay informed. I mean, if you're part of the ecosystem, you kind of need to know what's happening just as in your town, you kind of ought to know whether there's a mayor or a city council, and maybe occasionally see, are they up to anything? Is there an election? Find your friend who follows politics closely and ask them periodically, maybe every few months. So what's up with the city council? And, find out if there's anything up. Because, like it or not, governance affects, if you're in the EOS mainnet, the governance of the EOS mainnet affects you, just as if you're in a town, the governance of that town affects you. And you have maybe a duty, and certainly it's in your self-interest to not be completely tuned out.
I have to agree. And as I said, I don't necessarily have time to contribute just because I'm super busy.
If you're not a hobbyist or a really, really big token holder, then I don't know why on earth you'd stay up to speed on a daily basis. I mean, you'd have to be enjoying it to do that, or just be kind of a nerd for I read politics. I admit it. I read the Gov channel. I read the Alliance channel. I lead a bunch of other channels. I lurk. I read the Wall Street Journal and find out what's happening in the politics in Myanmar. I'm never going to Myanmar in my life. I'll never go there. Nothing that happens there will ever affect me directly, and I still read about it.
I do the same thing. I'm a lurker too, and I do actually. That's like usually my breaks. When I have a few extra minutes, I'll go in and I'll lurk around. I like to check out a lot of the BP channels as well to kind of see what they have going on and what they're talking about.
Yeah, right.
There's always some cool stuff happening. But in between governance and definitely the EOS Alliance, it's interesting. Like I make time and maybe I'm kind of like halfway in between that guy who just like has tokens and the guy who like really, really, really cares because I care and it's important to me, but I just don't have the time. And then I think it's also important too. Like if it's okay to go in there. If you have something to contribute, then contribute. But at the same time, maybe if you don't have something to contribute, or if you're not as up on governance and you're just kind of getting into the ecosystem, it's a good idea to just kind of do what we're talking about and just lurk for a little while and maybe catch up until you have something valid to contribute. So I'll continue to do that. I'll continue to lurk. Is there anything else going on with the EOS Alliance? Any other issues or any kind of thing that's front and center that might be worth having a conversation about today?
Oh, there's always stuff going on. Let's see. Well, of course, the EOS Alliance is hosting the ongoing Constitution conversation, the dialogue in 3 languages, now 4 actually, because the Russians have joined in. So every week for the past 6 or 7 weeks and going on until we hit at least 12 weeks total, we're having every week a call in Mandarin spoken, Korean, English, and now Russian to talk about the version 1 constitution, the version 2 constitution. There's some talk about maybe a version 3 constitution being some sort of synergy that unites them all, because we're going to have eventually, fairly soon, a referendum contract available where the token holders could vote on reforming the Constitution or ratifying the current one or something. And so we should probably, as a community, be thinking about how do we want to govern ourselves, and if we're going to revise the Constitution, how do we want to revise it, and what are the trade-offs? And that's been, I think, a very interesting and productive conversation. One thing I'll mention is that it's the only place I've seen in all of cryptos and in the EOS ecosystem where we have equal numbers of women and men. Equal numbers of women and men on many of these calls, which is wonderful. And I think that it sends a sign of inclusivity. It gives us good diversity, and I think it's delightful that we've got good, broad, inclusive participation in these conversations. And I'll tell you, the Chinese groups were very quiet in April and May. I could not engage with them when I was trying to get community input on the version 1 constitution, but they're making up for it now. The Chinese groups are very engaged, very vocal. We've got several people who are conducting independent weekly calls to discuss it. There's a guy named Jun who has a weekly study group on Thursdays that I have penciled on my calendar and I haven't been able to make. But I want to. Every week I want to make it. I might make it this week.
Jun does really good work. I tune into some of his stuff quite often.
And this is how we as a community both build our unity and ultimately make collective decisions, which is what governance is, the making of collective decisions.
Yeah.
Okay, if everyone says, governance like it's some spooky, weird, special thing, it's a collective decision making. That's it. It's making the decision, it's carrying out the decision, and it's tweaking the decision-making rules. That's governance. Those three things, super simple. Actually doing it is hard because we're humans and we're fractious and we misunderstand each other, and some of us are jerks, and we don't always trust each other's motives. Maybe we shouldn't always. And it's hard to get agreement. And here we are, this decentralized entity, the EOS blockchain. If it were more centralized, we'd be less chaotic, right? And governance would look a lot easier because the central authorities would just pull some strings and make stuff happen. The fact that that's not occurring tells you we are functionally decentralized. And that means we, as a community, have to show up and have these conversations and make some collective decisions periodically. The most important one coming up, I think, is the Constitution. Ratify the current one, replace it with Dan's version 2, which I personally think is insufficiently developed. I thought it was a good starting point, but I don't think it was ready to be enacted as written. Someone I think recently released their own version 3 that synthesized some of the two, which I thought was good. But we need to continue this dialogue and get to a point of closure so that we can put some options in front of the token holders so that the referendum contract can be used to say, here are 3 constitutions, right? The current interim one, Dan's version 2, maybe this here version 3, if someone can make a version 3, maybe even a 4th one, who knows, hopefully not too many choices because crowded ballots confuse people. And it could be, check next to everyone you'd be willing to live under. So preference voting. And then whichever one gets the most votes becomes the ratified new constitution, and it would take effect within 30 days of the close of the vote or whatever. And by the way, writing a ballot is not easy. Making it clear can get very confusing. We've actually started a group on Telegram specifically on the mechanics of writing ballots.
Interesting.
And got a friend of mine, Eric Winters, has written probably a dozen initiatives for the Oregon ballot to come and talk to us about ballot writing, because you need to have the actual legal text, which is very, very long, but then you need a summary that's short, maybe 100 words, that explains like what the heck this thing does. And you need those to be honest and accurate and clear, and that's hard to do. I'll add one other little wrinkle, and actually need to go. I'm late for another meeting, but one of the things we don't yet have in our community is a clear understanding of how to control ballot access. Because if anybody can put anything on the ballot, everybody will, and you'll get, here are 1,000 things to vote on. I promise you, no one's voting on 1,000 things. Remember I mentioned the whole 20 people deciding what to get for pizza?
Yep.
Put a couple of zeros after that. That's a mess. All right, and you want voter fatigue and voter tune out? That's one way to get it. So I think collectively as a community, we're going to have to make some decisions on what does it take for an initiative to get enough preliminary interest that we want to see it. And if you have a good idea, it shouldn't be hard to get support.
For sure.
But we haven't, again, no one's put up any barriers because no one's, empowered to put up any barriers. And the referendum contract that is being worked on now has no barriers in it. So we can confidently expect there to be hundreds or even thousands of initiatives in it right away. So we're going to have to come up collectively as a community with how do we handle the clutter and reduce the noise and focus people on the signal and get these collective decisions made.
Brilliant.
That's what's up.
I love it. Thanks again for chatting with me. I'm hoping that I can snag you for another another session next week or the next time you get open.
I very much hope so too. I enjoy it very much. I know we're a little bit rambly, which is almost all my fault, but hopefully pieces of this are interesting.
I find it interesting. You know what? If it's just you and me enjoying this, then that's good enough. But I think we'll have some other support.
We made two people happy.
Exactly. It's good enough.
There you go.
Again, Thomas, I'll make sure I'll post all the links for the EOS Alliance chat, governance chat, and everything else that we chatted about below. So thanks again for coming on, and I look forward to doing this.
My pleasure. Thanks. Take care.
See you, buddy. Bye.